identical to the ruling elite theory. What's different about biased pluralism? I think it's a mashup of ruling elite theory and pluralism. Biased pluralism means that interest groups that represent wealthy, powerful interests seem to have the greatest influence on decision making. Which of these theories seems most accurate to you? If you were going to pick one of these theories.
In Indian lands is areas that are often protected. I didn't mention much about Native American lands, but that is a core principle for most tribes in protecting the lands of the reservations for Native Americans in the United States. In between the two here, we didn't mention too much about state parks and state forests. Both of those exist, in fact, and even some towns in the northeastern United States have town forests in which there is protected land. So in Texas, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department is responsible for protecting lands in Texas state parks, such as Bastrop State Park to the east of Austin.
So the idea is this. A company makes and sells things, items. How many items do they make and sell? Let's say they make X and sell of them. Make X and sell X, right? So the number of items they make, let's assume they sell all of those items as well. So of course the idea is that how does a company make items? How does a company make things? How does Apple make iPods? Leftmost side we had to point to. So we solve that compound inequality. Again, our unknown is right in the middle, as it should be. But we're going to add 7.4 to all three of those sides. 7.4 plus negative 0.2 is 7.2. 7.4 plus x minus 7.4 is x. 0.2 plus 7.4 is 7.6. So x.
5, civil rights. I think 3 important lessons we've already covered are the importance of the civil rights movement of African Americans because it inspired other minority groups to seek their civil rights, to struggle to fight for their equality. Also, we studied interpreting equality, the 3 different tests that the Supreme Court uses to evaluate whether actions, policies, or laws of the government violate civil rights. The rational basis test, hardly any law is ever found discriminatory under this easygoing test. The intermediate scrutiny test is applied to what kind of cases, what sort of discrimination
there is in warm air, where there's more energy to the molecules, they're vibrating more, and they're leaving the surface of the liquid and going into a vapor phase, into a gas phase. Now, how much moisture the air can hold basically, it doesn't really hold it, contain at any given temperature is reference to a temperature in the atmosphere known as the dew point. The dew point is when the air is 100% saturated with all of the moisture that will remain in gas phase at that temperature.
Straight to the result. 79 is not a multiple of 4. But when we divide 79 by 4, we see that 4 divides into 79 19 times with the remainder of 3. So 79 divided by 4 is 19 and 3/4. Notice I put a plus sign here. A different example would be something like this. What if we had, say, 7/4? Well, how many times does 4 go in?
Did the framers of the Constitution want political parties? Spencer and Matthew, you're exactly right. The framers of the Constitution thought that political parties would be like factions. They would work selfishly. They specifically did not want political parties because they believed, well, maybe a political party would be even more dangerous than a faction because political parties would offer candidates for election to political office, and political parties would have a toehold, a grasp on.
We need this optimism right now, don't we? And so we'll talk about that. So renewable energy alternatives to some of the non-renewable energy that we talked about in the last chapter. That is the fossil fuels and nuclear power. And this comes from a whole bunch of different sources. We're going to talk about biomass first. This is using organic material, plant matter, and both living and dead as sources of energy. We'll talk about a source of energy that's been used extensively as a source of power, certainly since the Depression, and that's hydroelectric energy. We'll look at the two number one and number two for upcoming sources of energy: wind power and solar power. We'll look at geothermal power, how that
would be right here, right? Y-axis would be somewhere between -2 and 2. Okay, so we put the boundary numbers, the 3 boundary numbers we have on that number line, and those of course correspond to points on the line. And this gives us 4 intervals that we need to test. So numbers that are less than -2, the interval from -infinity to -2, numbers that are between -2 and 2, the interval from -2 to 2, the interval from 2 to 7, the interval from 7 to infinity. So of course we do not include the boundary numbers here. Notice that the boundary using a factoring method that is already familiar to us. So in particular, we want to solve this equation by factoring and by using the zero product property. So the factoring method we're going to use here for that expression is factoring by grouping, because what we have here is a 3rd degree polynomial, and there are 4 terms. The right-hand side is already 0. Of course, if that had not been the case, we would have to rearrange the terms so that we'd have 0 on one side. And that's important because we're eventually going to use the zero product property, which requires us to have 0 on one side of the equation. Okay, so we're going to group the first 2 terms together.
3 less neutrons than uranium-238, so it's slightly lighter. So it's actually that difference in weight, atomic weight between the 2 kinds is useful in processing the uranium for using it in nuclear fuel. So when we mine natural uranium, either from that mine in Wyoming or the one in South Texas, we're getting both kinds of isotopes, uranium-238 and 235. But what we're only interested in making energy from this is uranium-235. We need a concentration of uranium-235. We have to concentrate enough of it there to sustain a reaction of fission. And we'll talk about this fission reaction in just a bit. It's actually a chain reaction in which one atom splits and that releases neutrons, which attack another atom basically, and they split. And so we need a high enough concentration of this uranium-235, over 5% of this, much higher than the natural concentration, which is actually a little bit less than 1%. So we need a way of concentrating more of the uranium-235 in this fuel that we want to put in a nuclear reactor than there is U-238. And so we use this difference in weight, atomic weight, to concentrate it. And this process is called enrichment. It can make you enriched.
So let's make a table for this function f, which is 3 times x plus 6. We know that's a linear function, right? We've talked about linear functions quite a bit this semester. So for that function, we're going to choose x values of -4, -2, 0, 2, and 4. Of course, we can choose any input values we want. This table just illustrates what happens with those particular input values. So what about an input of -4? Well, 3 times -4 is -12. -12 plus 6 is -6. 3 times -2 is -6. -6 plus 0 is 0. -6 plus 6 is 0, sorry. 3 times 0 is 0. 0 plus 6 is 6, and so forth. So we see this table here. So That's not hard to make a table for f. But what we're trying to point out here is that how is that table for f related to this table for f inverse? Notice that the table for f inverse has input values of -6, 0, 6, 12, and 18. Now, for the table for f, we used an input value of -4, and then we get an output of -6. That was just arithmetic. What happens is that when we use -6 as an input for f inverse, we get an output of -4, right? Notice that that has switched. Input -4, output -6 for f corresponds to an input value of -6 and an output of -4 for f inverse. So this is the case for all of these: -2, 0, 0, -2. F of -2 is 0. F inverse of 0 is -2. F of 0